Batavia was a ship of the Dutch East India Company. It was built in Amsterdam in 1628, and armed with 24 cast-iron cannons and a number of bronze guns. Batavia was shipwrecked on her maiden voyage, and was made famous by the subsequent mutiny and massacre that took place among the survivors. A 20th-century replica of the ship is also called the Batavia and can be visited in Lelystad, Netherlands. Mutiny on the Batavia. Departure and voyage. On October 27, 1628, the newly built Batavia, commissioned by the Dutch East India Company, sailed from Texel for the Dutch East Indies, to obtain spices. It sailed under commander and opperkoopman Francisco Pelsaert, with Orion Jacobs serving as skipper. These two had previously encountered each other in Surat, India. Although some animosity had developed between them there, it is not known whether Pelsaert even remembered Jacobs when he boarded Batavia. Also on board was the onderkoopman Geronimus Cornelis, a bankrupt pharmacist from Haarlem who was fleeing the Netherlands, in fear of arrest because of his heretical beliefs associated with the painter Johannes van der Beek, also known as Terentius. During the voyage, Jacobs and Cornelis conceived a plan to take the ship, which would allow them to start a new life somewhere, using the huge supply of trade gold and silver then on board. After leaving Cape Town, where they had stopped for supplies, Jacobs deliberately steered the ship off course, away from the rest of the fleet. Jacobs and Cornelis had already gathered a small group of men around them and arranged an incident from which the mutiny was to ensue. This involved molesting a high-ranking young female passenger, Lucretia Jans, in order to provoke Pelsaert into disciplining the crew. They hoped to paint his discipline as unfair and recruit more members out of sympathy. However, the woman was able to identify her attackers. The mutineers were then forced to wait until Pelsaert made arrests, but he never acted, as he was suffering from an unknown illness. Shipwreck. On June 4, 1629 the ship struck Morning Reef near Beacon Island, part of the Houtman-April Hose off the western Australian coast. Of the 322 aboard, most of the passengers and crew managed to get ashore, although 40 people drowned. The survivors, including all the women and children, were then transferred to nearby islands in the ship's longboat and yawl. An initial survey of the islands found no fresh water and only limited food. Pelsaert realized the dire situation and decided to search for water on the mainland. A group comprising Captain Jacobs, Francisco Pelsaert, senior officers, a few crew members, and some passengers left the wreck site in a 30-foot longboat, in search of drinking water. After an unsuccessful search for water on the mainland, they abandoned the other survivors and headed north in a danger-fraught voyage to the city of Batavia, now known as Jakarta. This journey, which ranks as one of the greatest feats of navigation in open boats, took 33 days and, extraordinarily, all aboard survived. After their arrival in Batavia, the boatswain, a man named Jan Everts, was arrested and executed for negligence and outrageous behavior before the loss of the ship. Jacobs was also arrested for negligence, although his position in the potential mutiny was not guessed by Pelsaert. Batavia's Governor-General, Jan Cohen, immediately gave Pelsaert command of the Sardam to rescue the other survivors, as well as to attempt to salvage riches from the Batavia's wreck. He arrived at the islands 2 months after leaving Batavia, only to discover that a bloody mutiny had taken place amongst the survivors, reducing their numbers by at least 100. Murders. Geronimus Cornelis, who had been left in charge of the survivors, was well aware that if the party ever reached the port of Batavia, Pelsaert would report the impending mutiny, and his position in the planned mutiny might become apparent. Therefore, he made plans to hijack any rescue ship that might return and use the vessel to seek another safe haven. Cornelis even made far-fetched plans to start a new kingdom, using the gold and silver from the wrecked Batavia. However, to carry out this plan, he first needed to eliminate possible opponents. Cornelis's first deliberate act was to have all weapons and food supplies commandeered and placed under his control. He then moved a group of soldiers, led by Wyatt Hayes, to nearby West Wallaby Island, under the false pretense of searching for water. They were told to light signal fires when they found water and they would then be rescued. Convinced that they would be unsuccessful, he then left them there to die. Cornwallis then had complete control. The remaining survivors would face 2 months of unrelenting butchery and savagery. With a dedicated band of murderous young men, Cornwallis began to systematically kill anyone he believed would be a problem to his reign of terror, or a burden on their limited resources. The mutineers became intoxicated with killing, and no one could stop them. They needed only the smallest of excuses to drown, bash, strangle or stab to death any of their victims, including women and children. Cornwallis never committed any of the murders himself, although he tried and failed to poison a baby. Instead, he used his powers of persuasion to coerce others into doing it for him, firstly under the pretense that the victim had committed a crime such as theft. Eventually, the mutineers began to kill for pleasure, or simply because they were bored. He planned to reduce the island's population to around 45 so that their supplies would last as long as possible. In total, his followers murdered at least 110 men, women, and children. Rescue. Although Cornwallis had left the soldiers, led by Wyatt Hayes, to die, they had in fact found good sources of water and food on their islands. Initially, they were unaware of the barbarity taking place on the other islands and sent pre-arranged smoke signals announcing their finds. However, they soon learned of the massacres from survivors fleeing Cornwallis Island. In response, the soldiers devised makeshift weapons from materials washed up from the wreck. They also set a watch so that they were ready for the mutineers, and built a small fort out of limestone and coral blocks. Cornwallis seized on the news of water on the other island, as his own supply was dwindling and the continued survival of the soldiers threatened his own success. He went with his men to try to defeat the soldiers marooned on West Wallaby Island. However, the trained soldiers were by now much better fed than the mutineers and easily defeated them in several battles, eventually taking Cornwallis hostage. The mutineers who escaped regrouped under a man named Waterloos and tried again, this time employing muskets to besiege Hayes' fort and almost defeated the soldiers. But Wyatt Hayes' men prevailed again, just as Lelystad arrived. A race to the rescue ship ensued between Cornwallis's men and the soldiers. Wyatt Hayes reached a ship first and was able to present his side of the story to Lelystad. After a short battle, the combined force captured all of the mutineers. Aftermath. Lelystad decided to conduct a trial on the islands, because the Zardam on the return voyage to Batavia would have been overcrowded with survivors and prisoners. After a brief trial, the worst offenders were taken to Seal Island and executed. Cornwallis and several of the major mutineers had both hands chopped off before being hanged. Waterloos and a cabin boy, considered only minor offenders, were marooned on mainland Australia, never to be heard of again. Reports of unusually light-skinned Aborigines in the area by later British settlers have been suggested as evidence that the two men might have been adopted into a local Aboriginal clan. Some amongst the Imanga people of the mainland have a blood group specific to Leiden, in Holland. However, numerous other European shipwreck survivors, such as those from the wreck of the Zoetdorp in the same region in 1712, may also have had such contact with indigenous inhabitants. The remaining mutineers were taken to Batavia for trial. 5 were hanged, while several others were flogged. Cornwallis's second-in-command, Jacob Pietis, was broken on the wheel, the most severe punishment available at the time. Captain Jacobs, despite being tortured, did not confess to his part in planning the mutiny and escaped execution due to lack of evidence. What finally became of him is unknown. It is suspected that he died in prison in Batavia. A board of inquiry decided that Lelystad had exercised a lack of authority and was therefore partly responsible for what had happened. His financial assets were seized, and he died a broken man within a year. On the other hand, the common soldier Wyatt Hayes was hailed as a hero. The Dutch East India Company promoted him to sergeant, and later to lieutenant, which increased his salary fivefold. Of the original 341 people on board the Batavia, only 68 made it to the port of Batavia. Wreckage, discovery and recovery. During Admiralty surveys of the Abrolhos Islands on the northwest coast in April 1840, Captain Stokes of HMS Beagle reported that on the southwest point of an island the beams of a large vessel were discovered, and as the crew of the shipwreck, lost in 1728, reported having seen a wreck of a ship on this part, there is little doubt that the remains were those of the Batavia, Commodore Pelsart, lost in 1629. We in consequence named our temporary anchorage Batavia Road, and the whole group Pelsart Group. However, Stokes appears to have confused the wreck of the shipwreck for that of the Batavia in the 1950s. Historian Henrietta Drake Brockman, who had learnt of the story due to her association with the children of the Abrolhos Islands guano merchant F.C. Broadhurst, son of Charles Edward Broadhurst, argued from extensive archival research and translations by E.D. Drock, that the wreck must lie in the Wallaby group of islands. Surveyor Bruce Melrose and diving journalist Hugh Edwards agreed with the theory. In association with Drake Brockman, Edwards organized a number of search expeditions near Beacon Island in the early 1960s and narrowly missed locating the site. After Edwards provided his research to them, and after being led to the place by Abrolhos rock lobster fisherman Dave Johnson, on June 4, 1963 Max and Graham Cramer with Greg Allen became the first to dive on the site. Its location, together with those of the VOC ship Burgalder Drake and the English East India Company trial, in the early 1960s, led to the formation of the Departments of Maritime Archaeology and Materials Conservation and Restoration at the Western Australian Museum. In the period 1973 to 1974, under the leadership of maritime archaeologist Jeremy Green of the Western Australian Museum, some of the cannon from the Batavia wreck, an anchor, and many artefacts were salvaged, including timbers from the portside of the ship's stern. These were then conserved by the museum's conservation laboratories under the leadership of Colin Pearson and his successors Neil North and Ian MacLeod. Monitoring and treatment of the timbers is ongoing and is under the leadership of Ian Godfrey and Vicky Richards. In order to facilitate the monitoring and any future treatment, the hull timbers were erected on a steel frame designed and erected by Jeff Kimpton, a member of Green's staff. The design, and that of a stone arch, or portico, which was also raised from the seabed, is such that individual components can be removed for treatment without affecting those adjacent, or the exhibit as a whole. In 1972, the Netherlands transferred all rights to Dutch shipwrecks on the Australian coasts to Australia. Some of the items, including human remains, which were excavated, are now on display in the Western Australian Museum Euro Shipwreck Galleries in Fremantle, Australia. Others are held by the Western Australian Museum, Geraldton. These two museums presently share the remains. A replica stone arch is held in the Western Australian Museum Euro Shipwreck Galleries, which was intended to serve as a stone welcome arch for the city of Batavia, and the actual stone arch is held in the Western Australian Museum, Geraldton. The original timbers from the ship's hull are held at the Western Australian Museum Euro Shipwreck Galleries. While a great deal of materials have been recovered from the wreck site, the majority of the cannons and anchors have been left in situ. As a result, the wreck remains one of the premier dive sites on the West Australian coast and is part of the museum's Wreck Trail, or Underwater Museum Without Walls concept. Replica. A replica of the Batavia was built at the Batavia Wharf in Lelystad in the Netherlands. The project lasted from 1985 to April 7, 1995, and was conducted as an employment project for young people under master shipbuilder Willem Vos. The shipyard is currently reconstructing another 17th-century ship. In contrast to the merchant ship Batavia, Michiel de Ruyter's flagship, the Zeven Provinciën, is a ship of the line. The Batavia replica was built with traditional materials, such as oak and hemp, and using the tools and methods of the time of the original ship's construction. For the design, good use was made of the remains of the original ship in Fremantle, as well as historical sources, such as 17th-century building descriptions, and prints and paintings by artists, of similar ships. On September 25, 1999, the new Batavia was transported to Australia by barge, and moored at the National Maritime Museum in Sydney. In 2000, Batavia was the flagship for the Dutch Olympic team during the 2000 Olympic Games. During its stay in Australia, the ship was towed to the ocean once, where it sailed on its own. On June 12, 2001, the ship returned to the Batavia wharf in Lelystad, where it remains on display to visitors. On the evening of October 13, 2008, a fire ripped through the wharf. The museum's workshops, rigging loft, block shop, offices, part of a restaurant and the entire hand-sewn suit of sails of the ship were lost to the blaze. However, the replica of Der Zeven Provinciën nearby was undamaged. The moored Batavia was never in danger. Publications and other media. The following list is selective. The fascination with the wreck of Batavia has created an industry with many other books and articles written, besides the items shown below. 1647 Commander Pelsaert died the year after the event, leaving behind his journal of the events. This journal, together with the pamphlet Ongelukkige Voyage van t Ship Batavia, published in 1647, made it possible to rediscover the wreck. 1897 Willem Sieben Haas The Abrelhose Tragedy, a translation of Ongelukkige Voyage. Purchased and funded by the guano merchant Florence Broadhurst, the translation was subsequently published in the Western Mail. The events also formed the basis of a novel called Marooned on Australia, by the explorer Ernest Favink. The events were to feature in Malcolm Uren's work Sailormen's Ghosts, and Douglas Stewart's radio play Shipwrecked, in 1947. 1963 Renowned Australian author Henrietta Drake Brockman's comprehensive, non-fiction account Voyage to Disaster took her 10 years to write. She also wrote a fictional story based on the Batavia, The Wicked and the Fair in 1957. It was Drake Brockman's own research aided by journalist Hugh Edwards that led divers to the location of the wreck. 1966 journalist Hugh Edwards published an account of the shipwreck and its rediscovery by Dave Johnson, Max and Graham Kramer, and Greg Allen, under the name Island of Angry Ghosts, Murder, Mayhem and Mutiny. 1970s and 80s the tale was retold by a number of writers, including Lee Knowles' Batavia Incident in Cool Summers, Hal Colbatch's Batavia Suite, Mark O'Connor's poem sequence The Batavia and Nicholas Haslark's The Bellarmine Jug. 1970s and 1980s, the Western Australia Museum published reports on its excavation and research. These were based on Jeremy Green's archaeological report. 1990 Deborah Lisson's book The Devil's Own, which is aimed at young adults, is also based on the events of Batavia Mutiny and Massacre. This book won the Western Australian Premier's Award in 1991. 1991 a subplot in Gary Crew's novel Strange Objects included two men who sailed Batavia, Wouter Luz, and Jan Pelgrim. 1993 Philippe Godard's book The First and Last Voyage of the Batavia provides a wealth of illustrations, along with details of Batavia's construction, objectives and, of course, the traumatic events on the islands off the West Australian coast. At the end of the book is an English translation of Pelsaert's pamphlet regarding the events on Batavia. The construction of Batavia's second incarnation is also covered, with a number of detailed photographs of the new ship. 1995 Prospero Productions made a 52-minute documentary entitled Batavia Wreck, Mutiny and Murder, filmed on location. 2000 Arabella Edge's novel The Company is also based on the events of 1629, as is Catherine Heeman's novel The Accomplice. Whereas Edge tells the story from the perspective of Cornelius, the chief mutineer, Heeman's The Accomplice is based on the predicament of Judith Basiance, the predicant's daughter. 2000 The story was also told in a one-hour radio drama, Southland, written by DJ Britain and broadcast in September 2000 on BBC Radio 4. 2001 the story was retold in the form of an acclaimed opera, simply titled Batavia, composed by Richard Mills and first performed by Opera Australia. 2002 architect Fritz van Dungen, graphic designer Kees Nijenhuizen, and poet Gerrit Kouwenaar built an apartment complex in Amsterdam named Batavia, with a poem referencing the ship imprinted into a wall of the building. 2002 historian Mike Dash's book, Batavia's Graveyard, The True Story of the Mad Heretic Who Led History's Bloodiest Mutiny, told the whole story in more detail than ever before, making extensive use of Dutch archival sources to explore the early life of Cornelis, and a number of the Batavia's other passengers and crew. 2006 A Euro writer Simon Leys published The Wreck of the Batavia, a true story, relating the fate of the Batavia and her crew. The French version of this book, Les Naufrages copyright S2 Batavia, won the Guizot Prize. 2010 A Euro writer Greta van der Rohe published Dire Dry Death, a historical novel based on the true events of the wreck of the Batavia. It makes an argument for the innocence of the captain of the ship, Adrian Jacobs. 2010 A Euro The Blue-Eyed Aborigine by Rosemary Hayes is a historical novel for young adults portraying a wreck survivor's story. 2011 A Euro Batavia by Peter Fitzsimons is a creative non-fiction account of the Batavia. 2014 A Euro Hell and High Water with music by Matthew Seymour and lyrics by Jacqueline Osorio and Karen Davey is a musical, produced as a semi-staged production at the Queensland Conservatorium, Brisbane, Australia, having been first conceived in 2007. See also, Shipwrecks of Western Australia, Anchorads. Notes. References, Balkan, Evan. Shipwrecked. Deadly Adventures and Disasters at Sea. Birmingham, Alabama, Menasha Ridge, 2008, pages 68 to 78, crew, Gary. Strange Objects Port Melbourne, Vic Mammoth Australia, 1991. ISBN 1-86330-113-5, Mike. Batavia's Graveyard London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, 2002. ISBN 0-575-07024-2, Drake Brockman, Henrietta. Voyage to Disaster Western Australia, University of Western Australia Press, 1995. ISBN 1-875560-32-7, Edge, Arabella. The Company, The Story of a Murderer Sydney, Picador, 2000 ISBN 0-330-48978-X, Edwards, Hugh, Islands of Angry Ghosts London, Hodder and Stoughton, 1966, Juritzen, Rupert, and Their Ghosts May Be Heard 1994, Fremantle Arts Centre Press ISBN 1-86368-063-2, Godard, Philippe. The First and Last Voyage of the Batavia Perth, W.A., Abrelhos Publishing 1993. ISBN 0-646-10519-1, Listen, Deborah The Devil's Own Port Melbourne, Vic, Lothian, 2000. First ed. Glebe, NSW, Walter McVitie, 1990, ISBN 0-7344-0128-0, Leys, Simon The Wreck of the Batavia and Prosper Melbourne, Black Incorporated, 2005. ISBN 1-86395-150-4. External links, The Batavia Story, a detailed account of the mutiny, Pelsat, Ongelokij Voyage, Van Ship Batavia, Nada Used Indian, NL, Batavia Model Ship, a scaled replica of the replica, www.bataviaphotos.com. Photo gallery of the new Batavia built in the Netherlands by Willem Vos, Batavia's replica longboat in Geraldton, Western Australia, Batavia at the Western Australian Museum's website.